I never understood why my parents even bothered to have me. If you looked at them from the outside, you'd think they had the perfect life, a big house, respectable jobs, and they always looked put together. But there was something wrong, something off, about the way they treated me, something I didn't realize until much later. Growing up, I always felt like an outsider in my own home, like a guest overstaying their welcome. My mother was cold, distant, and my father, well, he was barely around to even pretend to care. I don't know exactly when I figured out that I wasn't wanted. It wasn't one of those dramatic moments you see in movies where a kid overhears their parents talking, or they read a journal entry that reveals a terrible truth. It was more of a slow, painful realization that settled deep in my bones, like a weight I couldn't shake. The way they barely acknowledged my birthdays, year after year. The candles on the cake grew fewer, the presents smaller, until one year there was nothing at all, not even a card. I remember standing in the kitchen on my 12th birthday, waiting for my mom to say something, anything. She looked up from her magazine for a second, sighed, and said, "Oh, happy birthday, I guess," before turning back to the glossy pages, as if that half-hearted mutter would somehow make up for the emptiness that sat between us. School events were no different. I'd scan the crowd at every recital, every science fair, looking for their faces, and when I didn't find them, I'd tell myself maybe they got stuck at work, or maybe they'd just missed this one. But they missed every one. My teachers would ask, "Where are your parents?" I'd shrug and smile, pretending it didn't bother me. I got so good at pretending that it almost felt real. Almost. But it was the way they spoke about their lives before I came along that hurt the most. They would sit at the dinner table, talking about the places they'd traveled, the spontaneous trips to Europe, the music festivals, the wild parties. Their eyes would light up, and they'd laugh at inside jokes I wasn't a part of. I'd sit there, silent, pushing food around on my plate, knowing that to them, those were the best years of their lives. The years before me. They spoke of those days like they were the golden age, a time when they were free and happy, before I came along and ruined everything. Once, I remember sneaking into their bedroom, opening a drawer filled with old photographs. I wanted to see the version of them that they cherished so much. The version they always seemed to miss. And there they were, young, carefree, laughing in the sun, arms wrapped around each other. They looked alive in those pictures, a way they never did around me. There was one photo in particular that I couldn't stop staring at. It was them on a beach somewhere, my mother's head thrown back in laughter, my father's arm draped lazily over her shoulders. They looked so different, so in love, so happy. I never saw them look at each other like that again. It was then that it hit me. I was never supposed to be part of their story. I wasn't some missing piece that completed their family. I was the interruption, the mistake. They didn't say it out loud, but I could feel it in every interaction, in every hollow word exchanged. They tolerated me because they had to, not because they wanted to. And no matter how hard I tried to be good, to make them proud, it didn't matter. I was just a burden they had to bear, a responsibility they never signed up for. The worst part, they didn't even bother to hide it. I overheard them once when they thought I was asleep. My mother's voice, low and sharp, cut through the quiet of the night. If we hadn't had her, we could have retired by now, she said. My father didn't argue, he just grunted in agreement. The words sliced through me, deeper than anything I'd ever felt before. It was confirmation of what I'd known all along. I was a regret they couldn't escape. From that moment on, I stopped hoping. I stopped waiting for them to change, to suddenly start loving me the way parents are supposed to love their children. The realization that I wasn't wanted wasn't a revelation, it was a slow, suffocating truth that settled into my bones, making itself at home, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, to numb myself to it, it was always there, whispering in the back of my mind, "You were never meant to be here." By the time I turned 16, I had given up on trying to get their approval. I was just going through the motions, counting down the days until I could leave and never come back. I didn't care about the silence at dinner, or the fact that they would forget to pick me up from school. I didn't care that the hugs and kisses I saw other kids get from their parents was something I would never experience. I had built a wall around myself, strong and tall, and I convinced myself that I didn't need them. Then came the car. It was supposed to be a rite of passage, something every teenager looked forward to. My parents had promised me a car when I turned 17, and even though I tried not to care, a part of me hoped it would be something nice, something that showed they at least thought of me. When my birthday came, they handed me the keys with barely any fanfare. I remember staring down at the keychain, a cheap plastic thing with a faded dealership logo, and feeling the pit in my stomach grow. The car was parked in the driveway, an old, rusted-out sedan that looked like it had been through hell and back. The paint was peeling, the tires were bald, and the interior smelled like mildew. I didn't know much about cars, but I knew enough to realize this thing was a death trap. My dad gave me a half-hearted smile and said something about how it just needed a little TLC. But I knew better. They didn't buy this car because they wanted to give me something. They bought it because they didn't care if I ended up wrapped around a tree. It was the kind of realization that hit you all at once. Like ice water being thrown in your face. They didn't want me, and they didn't care if I lived or died. In fact, they might have preferred the latter. The thought made me sick, but I pushed it down, forced myself to pretend that it didn't bother me. I had gotten good at pretending by then. I started driving the car to school, hoping it wouldn't fall apart on the highway. Every time I turned the key, the engine would sputter and groan like it was struggling to come to life. I took it to a mechanic once, but the cost to fix everything was more than the car was worth. So, I kept driving it, listening for the sound of something breaking or catching fire. The brakes were shot, the transmission was slipping, and sometimes the steering wheel would lock up when I made a sharp turn. It was only a matter of time before something went horribly wrong. I never told my parents about the car's problems. What was the point? They knew exactly what they had given me, and they didn't care. Besides, I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing that their little plan was working. If they wanted me gone, they were going to have to wait. A few months after I got the car, something happened that changed everything. It was a Friday night, and I had driven to a friend's house after school. We were hanging out in her backyard, sitting around a fire pit and talking about whatever it is teenagers talk about when they're trying to pretend that life is fine. At some point, someone brought up the idea of going for a drive, maybe grabbing something to eat, and before I could stop myself, I offered to drive. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was trying to prove something. Maybe I was just tired of sitting around. Either way, we all piled into my car, and I started the engine, praying it wouldn't die in front of everyone. We pulled out of the driveway, and for the first few minutes, everything was fine. The car rattled and shook like usual, but it was still moving. Then we hit the highway. I was in the left lane, trying to keep up with traffic, when I felt the steering wheel lock up. It happened so fast that I didn't even have time to react. 1 minute I was driving, and the next, the car was veering off to the side, heading straight for the guardrail. I slammed on the brakes, but nothing happened. The car kept moving, the tires screeching against the pavement. My friends were screaming, but their voices were drowned out by the sound of metal crunching as we hit the guardrail. For a moment, everything was still. The car was tilted at an odd angle, half of it hanging over the edge of the embankment. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, shallow and fast, as I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. My friends were crying, but they were okay. Somehow, we were all okay. I don't remember how we got out of the car, but we did. We stood on the side of the highway, staring at the wreckage, the smell of burnt rubber and gasoline filling the air. A few cars passed by, but no one stopped to help. Eventually, one of my friends called her parents, and they came to pick us up. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. When I finally did go home the next day, my parents didn't even ask what had happened. They didn't ask where the car was, or why I had been gone all night. They just went about their business like nothing had changed. And maybe, to them, nothing had. Maybe they had expected this all along. But I knew, deep down, that I couldn't stay there anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that I didn't care about the way they treated me. So, I packed a bag, took whatever money I had saved up, and left. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than there. As I drove away in a borrowed car, I realized something. They had given me the car, hoping I'd crash, hoping I'd disappear from their lives. But they hadn't counted on one thing. I was stronger than they thought. I wasn't going to crash. I was going to survive. And one day, they'd regret ever trying to get rid of me.